Hey, I'm Gina. Welcome to the Oh, There's More podcast, a space to get real and go deep. No more just checking the boxes and going through the motions. It's time to live out the beautiful life that God has written for you. On today's episode, we are going to dive into the difference between familiarity and comfort so that you can identify areas where you may be stuck in familiarity. I find myself in this place of comparing things often, and today is no different. So let's talk about the difference between what familiar and comfortable is. As humans, we're literally created by God to stay safe. Our brains are wired to keep us in a place of safety. Situations, places, or even people that are familiar are safe in our minds and even to our bodies. So when we get the courage to face some of the things that we need to heal from, and God invites us to step into the unknown, it can be really hard because our brains and our bodies are saying, oh, no, this is not safe. Hello, what are you doing? I do not want to go there. Stop. I had to take some time to sit in this and figure out why this was happening, since I knew there were things in my belief system that were off. There were lies that I was believing that I was then making decisions based off of. And what I found is that comfortable and familiar are actually not the same. The very definition of comfort is a state of physical ease and freedom from pain or constraint. So I want you to hold on to that definition. Comfort is freedom from pain or a state of physical ease. On the other hand, familiar is defined as being well known from a long or close association. So it's that, oh, hey, I've been here before. I know this place kind of thing. There's nothing in that definition that states whether it's safe, whether it's good or bad. And if you grew up in a home with turmoil and unrest, that kind of environment becomes familiar to you. And then when you find yourself in a relationship where there isn't turmoil, it can feel like something is off. Subconsciously, it can feel unfamiliar and therefore doesn't feel safe. What is familiar is dysfunction because of what you've experienced in the past. Since I grew up in a home that was unpredictable and felt unsafe, that's what I sought out in relationships. I sought out the familiar because it was what I knew and what I would say I was comfortable in. But if we revisit those two definitions, we can actually see that that wasn't true comfort. It was simply what I thought and perceived as safe because it was familiar. And that can lead us into all kinds of unhealthy places in our relationships with others, even in our jobs. It has this pull that we're often not even aware of, and so we stay immersed in it. I went through a long season of just being a yeller at my kids. It was familiar. It was all that I knew in parenting. I didn't know how else to handle the situation, to see the need that my kids had and to connect with them, to address their behavior, or how to even change my own knee-jerk reaction. I would just yell. It was familiar, and in all honesty, it felt like the easiest and safest thing to do. Yet it was not helping strengthen our relationship, and it definitely wasn't getting to the bottom of what was really going on with my kids. As God began to show me the root of it, I saw how it was my attempt to get big and to try to control the situation when things felt like they were spinning out of control. And isn't that so interesting? So the place of turmoil and chaos is exactly what was familiar in my own childhood. As a parent, when things felt out of control, I'd recreate what was known to me by being the one to add to the chaos and, in essence, like lead the chaos. My chaos of yelling would become bigger than whatever they were doing, whatever was going on, and that would make it feel less threatening to me if I was on the giving end of it versus the receiving end. I'm sure that we can all think of different ways where we operate in that place of familiarity versus what we actually need to be doing or should be doing. And of course, if our bodies and brains want to stay in that place of what we know, then stepping outside of that is going to be hard at times. We're going to have to literally fight against ourselves and fight that feeling of wanting to stay in what we know. There was a period of time after I went through my second divorce where the numbness was an incredibly hard mountain that I had to climb. In the past, what I would do is seek out somebody else, a man, in reality, any man, to help fill that void that I was feeling. It was like putting on a little itty bitty band-aid on this big, giant, gaping wound, right? It's not going to work. I knew that familiar place was not going to get me where I wanted to be, and yet in the past, I still chose it time and time and time again. It had that pull that I mentioned. We want to do differently, and yet for some reason, we just can't seem to. So here I am, divorced, newly single as a Christian for the first time ever in my life. And I'd come into this place of knowing more about Jesus. I still carried around rejection and abandonment and so many other traumas and hurts from my past. But what was different this time was that I was anchored to hope. And that hope was Jesus. I was not going to go back to the familiar. And yet that felt really hard at times. It even felt in some ways unsafe, like I was without protection in some way as a single woman. But having God in my life enabled me to stay in that place of discomfort and not revert back to what I had known in the past. I knew I couldn't go back to that old behavior, but in all honesty, this new place didn't feel good either. That in-between place where there was tension from knowing I couldn't go backwards, but also not being comfortable in the present, was where some of the deeper healing was able to happen. And I got to this place where I was finally able to be like, oh, okay, wow, I am good to be single. I'm actually not alone. And I don't actually need someone to fill this void because it's been filled by God. As things are revealed, you'll be able to see how the deep wounds from your past have blinded you. You'll be able to clearly see what's true and what's kept you in such an unhappy and even miserable place. Familiar is not your friend. And now you'll have the ability to say no to it and choose to step out into uncharted territory where you can experience healthy relationships, healthy ways of responding and interacting in your day-to-day life. You'll get to experience what it looks like to be comfortable instead of settling for what's familiar. As I'll continue to say, I'm all about honesty, and that includes when talking about this journey to healing. And I'll probably also say this 1,000 times. The journey is not always easy, but it is always worth it. There's never been a point where I stopped and I said to myself, yeah, this is so not worth it. I am done. I have stopped and said to God, I need to pause. I feel like I can't breathe. It's all happening so fast. I just need a moment to sit here and ground myself again. Like, please, just give me a moment, God. And amazingly enough, He's done just that for me. There will be plenty of times where you probably are going to think to yourself, what the heck am I doing? And why did I choose to do this? But when you get through that rough patch and you can breathe again, you will be so stinking grateful that you didn't give up, because you'll now be in this place of healing and freedom in an area or from something that was holding you back from living in fullness. When we begin this journey and we start to address the things that are just not working for us in our life, we're going to have to face that feeling of discomfort. But interestingly enough, chances are if you're saying, hey, this is not working in my life, you're already feeling some discomfort. That old familiar way of being, of reacting, of navigating relationships will begin to be a place you steer away from instead of being pulled to. When we make that decision to steer away from the familiar, we are signing up essentially to feel momentary discomfort at an even greater level for the sake of that growth and healing that we're so desiring. We're stepping out of the familiar and learning new ways of being in our minds and our bodies. So instead of running away from what doesn't feel so great, we will see how we have to stand still and find a new way to navigate through it. Instead of keeping the peace simply to avoid an issue, we may have to start setting boundaries or even removing ourselves from situations and relationships as they stand right now in order to seek that change that we know is so crucial in our healing. And here's the thing, it won't always feel good. It's hard. Our bodies will be asking, why are we acting so dangerously? It reminds me a little bit of that movie Inside Out, where the girls' emotions are characters. And there's that one that does not like the unknown. I think it actually might even be the character anxiety. I'm not sure. But anyway, it just makes me giggle a little because that's exactly what it's like. And healing isn't linear. In most cases, we may have to seek out different ways to walk through what that next step is for us. One of those steps for me was to see a trauma-informed Christian counselor for a few months. And honestly, I initially went there because I wanted my body to stop reacting. Anytime that I perceived that there could be conflict, I would have this reaction in my body. My heart would race, I would start to tremble, and I would want to run as far and as fast as I could to get away from it. Did you catch that though? It wasn't only when there was actually an issue that needed to be addressed. It was even in times where I'd made up some crazy scenario about how this conversation was going to go over the said topic with a said person. And for anybody with an ex-spouse, you know that there unfortunately are plenty of opportunities to go down this road of either perceived or real conflict. And I hated how my heart felt like it was going to beat out of my chest and I would start trembling. Clearly, there was something wrong with me, right? My counselor told me about 3 different aspects that play a factor in these really uncomfortable moments. And one is what we have experienced in childhood, our own trauma. Another one is our experience with conflict. If we've had practice in situations with conflict, and how was it received? What was the outcome? Was it good or was it not so good? Were we met with anger, loss of relationships, harsh words, or was there healthy resolution that came from it? And then lastly was simply the way that we're wired, how God made us. Some people are made to be confronters. And of course, that's in God's way, right? Confronting in love. But others are meant to be like that super nurturing, caring person, or someone who is just loads of fun. And she told me that based off of what she had learned about me, conflict was probably never going to be something that I loved and was just totally fine with. God made me a certain way, and it wasn't an indication that there was something wrong with me. And I'm going to admit, I definitely had mixed feelings about hearing this. I was like, boo, and also, woohoo. I wanted different news though. I wanted there to be a quote unquote solution. I wanted to have a way that we could figure out the issue and then I would be okay with conflict and I wouldn't have to be in these really uncomfortable places, because who wants to be uncomfortable? Not me. Conflict is a place of tension for me, one that is not really fun. And in my past, conflict has more often than not resulted in a not so great outcome. There wasn't a resolution, there was increased tension, there was anger, or even loss of relationships. And some days, I'd still like there to be another way for me to do this, or to just revert back to what was familiar and felt easier. To handle conflict by either completely avoiding it or just getting really big and loud and even mean with my words. But that's just it, though. It felt easier because it was all I'd known. There's that foe of ours called familiar again, right? But handling conflict in those ways wasn't better for me or anyone around me. It was actually damaging to relationships and to myself. When we don't face the thing that's causing conflict and have a resolution, whether that just be within ourselves or with the other people involved, it just leads to more internal conflict. Hopefully you're starting to see how there's this pattern of unhealthy places also being places of familiarity. Being paralyzed and wanting to stay safe in familiar territory can hold us back from the fullness of life that God has for us. So being able to recognize them is so important. The tension that we feel there, that uncomfortable that's in the place of familiarity, isn't the same as the uncomfortable that we feel when we're choosing to step out and respond differently. For a long time, familiarity kept me in unhealthy relationships with bipolar alcoholics, men who used drugs, men who were physically abusive, psychologically abusive, pathological liars, like you name it, I sought it out. And because the chaos felt familiar to me, I stayed in it way longer than I ever should have. I share more about this in my book, No Longer Sensual, which is on my website, and how I knew I couldn't go back to that old life of seeking out men as a band-aid, but I was also terrified of what that meant and how it would feel to be alone and ultimately to face my own stuff. It was that fear of the unknown that kept me in the place of familiar for far too long. And what's wild is you think that you're comfortable and you're really actually uncomfortable. Does the place that you're in actually feel good? If you have that nudging feeling to leave or to change something even in yourself or your own life, and you can't seem to do it, is it because you know how uncomfortable the leaving or the changing will feel? Can I prompt you to just maybe spend some time really evaluating how comfortable you are in whatever has come up for you as I have been talking today? Is what you're imagining even worse than what the outcome will be? What's actually keeping you in a place of familiarity? The fear of the unknown is often that thing that lurks around the corner from the familiar and keeps us from changing our circumstances or ourselves. And we don't want to be stuck because we have mistaken familiarity for comfort. Ask God to show you where this may be happening in your life, friend. And I'm praying for the courage to change it so that you can feel the joy of being free from the familiar. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe, leave a rating or review, and share it with your people. You can go to my website, ginapeak.com, to find extra resources and info. Until next time.